In a normal medieval year, survival depended on a routine that barely worked. Most families grew what they ate, and what they ate was grain. Bread, porridge, ale. Different forms, same foundation. Meat and fresh vegetables helped, but they were not the base that carried people through the calendar. The harvest did not create comfort. It created a narrow margin. That margin stayed thin because there were few safety nets. Storehouses held limited grain, and much of it went out again as rent, tax, or tithe. Seed had to be saved for planting, even when hunger pushed people to eat it. Animals needed fodder through winter, competing with humans for the same crops. By late winter, many communities already ran low, so the farming year felt like a tightrope. Spring planting gambled on weather that nobody controlled. Summer growth depended on enough sun, enough rain, and no sudden cold. Autumn harvest decided whether there was food until next year. There was no wide buffer, no extra cushion. One bad stretch of weather did not just reduce meals, it threatened existence. Then the year stopped behaving. Rains arrived at the wrong time and did not leave, turning fields into mud and cutting the days when work could happen. In other places, cold lingered into seasons that usually warmed, slowing growth that depended on a narrow window. And sometimes it went the other way, weeks without moisture, the soil cracking before grain could fill. One shift in weather began to pull the whole harvest off course. At first, the damage looked temporary, like a delay people could outrun. But crops did not wait. Seed that should have rotted in wet ground or sprouted weakly under a dim, cold sky. Hay meadows failed to thicken, so animals entered winter underfed. When the time came to cut and bring grain in, storms flattened stalks and washed out paths, or drought left heads light and empty. The harvest happened, but it came up short. That shortfall changed everything immediately because the calendar kept moving. Grain that should have carried households to the next summer now had to be measured against months of eating, feeding animals, and holding back seed for planting. Each basket taken from storage meant one less basket later, and there were no spare baskets to replace it. What had been a routine cycle of sowing and reaping turned into calculation and fear. The food shortage no longer felt possible, it felt scheduled. The harvest failed, but hunger did not arrive only in the fields. It arrived in the market. With less grain to sell, every sack mattered, and buyers competed fast. Prices rose first where the shortage hit, then spread along roads and rivers as merchants adjusted what they charged. A bad yield turned into a chain reaction. Grain stopped feeling like food. It started acting like money. For people who lived on wages, that change proved brutal. Pay did not rise at the same speed as bread. Day labor still brought the same coins, but those coins bought less each week. Families that once managed with careful portions now ran out before the next payday. The crisis shifted shape. It stopped being about what the land produced and became about who could afford to eat. Even those who grew some of their own food did not escape. Many needed the market to cover the gap between harvests or to replace what had spoiled. Now that gap became a trap. The poor sold small goods to buy grain, then faced the same prices again, only higher. Credit tightened, debts grew, and choice disappeared. In that moment, famine became a price tag. As the shortage widened, the weather stopped being the whole explanation. People made choices that turned bad harvests into empty bowls. Grain that still existed disappeared into barns and locked storehouses, held back from sale. Some owners waited for higher prices. Others simply refused to sell to neighbors when fear rose. The result looked like nature had wiped the land clean, but much of the food sat still, kept from mouths on purpose. Merchants and middlemen pushed the crisis further. Grain moved toward the places that paid most, not the places that needed it most. Buyers with cash bid up supplies, and speculation became a gamble on hunger. Each delay tightened the market, and each rumor of another failed crop drove prices higher. Poor families faced the new reality. It was not only the harvest that failed them, it was access, shaped by who could pay and who could wait. Then the roads and rivers became choke points. Lords and towns demanded tolls, and officials blocked carts at gates. Some regions banned exports to protect themselves, and neighboring regions answered with their own restrictions. Trade, which could have softened the blow, shrank at the moment it mattered most. Scarcity spread outward like a stain. In the end, the weather lit the fire, but policy and profit fed it, turning hunger into a weapon people used on one another. When prices stayed high and cupboards stayed bare, households started using the same ladder of survival rung by rung. First, they sold what they could spare, a cloak, a pot, a pig. Then they sold what they could not spare, the plough iron, the cart, the cow that gave milk. Each sale bought a few weeks. Each sale also cut the family's ability to recover. As the months dragged on, the choices turned sharper. People ate the breeding animals, then the work animals. They stretched bread with husks, weeds, and anything that filled the stomach. And when nothing remained, they opened the last reserve that was never meant for eating at all, the seed grain. It solved today's hunger by stealing tomorrow's harvest. With tools gone and seed consumed, foraging stopped being a supplement and became a main food source, and it failed fast. More hands searched the same woods and fields until even wild plants disappeared. Some people left to beg or find wages elsewhere, but travel cost strength they no longer had. Migration broke local labor just when planting needed it most. The famine renewed itself. Then the famine crossed a line. Hunger alone weakened people, but it also opened the door to something deadlier. With too little food, bodies lost the strength to fight ordinary infections. Small wounds festered. Fevers lasted longer. Children and the elderly slipped first. What looked like a food crisis started to behave like a health crisis. And once sickness followed hunger, the numbers no longer stayed steady. Displacement made it worse. Families left home to search for work, grain, or charity, and they carried illness with them or met it on the road. Crowding increased wherever people gathered, even briefly, and clean water and basic care became harder to find. Malnutrition and exhaustion turned coughs and stomach sickness into killers. The movement that once offered a chance to survive started to spread risk faster than relief. Disease changed the meaning of famine. Death no longer came only from empty bowls, but from epidemics that fed on weakness and fear. As more people died, fewer remained to plant, harvest, or care for the sick, and the community's support systems broke under the strain. Mortality rose in waves, not evenly. In that turning point, a season of hardship became a demographic catastrophe that lasted for years. As the hunger deepened, rulers and town councils could not pretend it was only a bad season. They reacted with rules. They set price caps for bread and grain, trying to force the market back into reach. They ordered mills and bakers to follow official measures. They banned exports, so local harvests stayed local. On paper, it looked decisive. In practice, it collided with fear, profit, and the simple fact that there was not enough food. When ceilings failed, authorities turned to requisitions. Officials demanded grain from estates, monasteries, and merchants, claiming it for the common need. Wagons moved under guard. Stores were counted, then seized. Some towns organized emergency purchases and public sales at fair prices. Charity expanded too. Alms, church distributions, and relief funds meant to keep people alive until the next harvest. But every intervention depended on compliance, and compliance depended on power. Enforcement broke where it mattered most. Sellers hid grain, watered measures, or shifted deals into private back rooms and night markets. Local officers hesitated to punish neighbours, but they also hesitated to challenge the wealthy. Export bans bent for well-connected traders. Requisitions hit small holders faster than big storehouses. Relief arrived last in the poorest lanes. The famine response exposed a hard truth. These systems protected order and property first, and hungry bodies second. As supplies tightened and official measures failed to reach everyone, patience ran out. Crowds gathered where food still existed: market stalls, mills, storehouses. Arguments over price and priority turned physical. Carts were stopped on roads, sacks were taken before they reached town, and guards faced people who had nothing left to lose. Hunger stopped being private. It became public pressure, applied in the open. Then the anger found targets. Granaries and barns were attacked, not for revenge, but for grain. Rumours did the rest. Outsiders, migrants, minorities, and travelling traders were blamed for empty shelves and high prices. Accusations spread faster than food. People who looked unfamiliar were driven off, beaten, or worse, as communities tried to seal themselves shut. In a famine, fear offered simple answers and demanded someone pay. The unrest also climbed upward. Tenants questioned rents when their children starved. Villagers resisted dues, tolls, and forced purchases, and some refused labour services outright. Town councils tried to control crowds while protecting merchants, and that choice fueled more violence. Lords answered with punishment, but harsh reprisals created martyrs and fresh rage. What began as scarcity now tested authority itself. The fight for bread became a fight over who ruled. When the worst hunger finally eased, the damage did not stop. Too many people had died or moved on, and fields sat empty because there were not enough hands to work them. Whole strips of land were left to weeds. Animals had been sold or eaten, tools had been pawned, seed had been burned through. Farming recovered slowly and unevenly. In some places, a village stayed alive only by shrinking. With labour scarce, the balance of power shifted. Lords still wanted rents and services, but they could not squeeze them from workers who no longer existed. Survivors bargained, moved, or refused, and they could often get better terms. Wages rose where work could be found. Rents fell on abandoned land, or contracts changed to pull tenants back. The old certainty of obligation weakened because scarcity now meant people, not grain. The famine also left new habits that stayed. Communities distrusted the market they had watched turn against them, so storage mattered more than ever. Those who could build bigger reserves, guarded them harder, and planned for multi-year shocks. Trade routes and town suppliers gained influence because food had to travel when local harvests failed. Rules around tolls, exports, and buying tightened. Afterward, medieval economies ran on a new lesson: control grain, control survival. Centuries later, the weather still decided harvests, but people no longer waited in the dark. Forecasts warned of drought, floods, and failed rains days and months ahead. Satellites tracked storms and soil moisture. Insurance, irrigation, and improved seed softened some shocks. Food also travelled farther than ever, so a bad season in one region did not automatically mean empty bowls in the next. Yet that bigger system created new fault lines. Global supply chains depended on fuel, ports, credit, and calm politics. When floods closed roads, when heat cut river traffic, when war or sanctions blocked exports, prices jumped fast and spread wide. Markets reacted before crops even failed. For poorer households, the problem again became access, not acreage. Hunger returned through the wallet. States also intervened more directly than medieval rulers had managed. Emergency stocks, cash transfers, food aid, and price controls reduced death in many crises. But relief followed power. Some regions received shipments, others faced delays, corruption, or deliberate neglect. Governments and companies still used scarcity to bargain, punish, or profit. The weapon no longer looked like rain alone. It looked like decisions made around it.